so much for being here. I was saying my name is Hugo Perez Trejo. I am the membership coordinator at the Latinx Therapist Action Network. And I want to welcome you all to this session. And we're going to talk about understanding your loved one's brain and neurodivergence in the immigrant family. But before that, I'm going to do a commercial because, this is something that is really exciting about this moment in the Latinx Therapist Action Network. So before that, I'm gonna introduce a little bit of the organization, a little bit of background. So the Latinx Therapist Action Network is a healing justice network of Latinx, Latine, Latino, Latina mental health practitioners, community health workers, activists, and organizers who are committed to interrupting the generational trauma caused by the U.S. carceral state and its immigration apparatus. This month, as maybe some of you know, is our anniversary. We are turning 5 years old, and it's exciting. And we want to celebrate that with a fundraising campaign. We named that campaign the Community Care Fund. And with this Community Care Fund, we will support people organizing on the front lines of the migrant justice movement. This fund offers financial access to emotional support for organizations leading powerful work to close detention centers, to reunite families separated by ICE, and these resources will directly facilitate healing justice tools and emotional support sessions for migrant justice organizers and community leaders. So I'm gonna put in the chat some of the links that you could use to donate and share and spread the word. So it doesn't matter if you donate $5, $10, whatever you can donate, it's gonna be helpful. The goal for us is to raise $20,000, and that would be really helpful to do some healing circles and to support people that is in the immigration movement. So that having said, I'm gonna just introduce Natalie, who is the keynote speaker today. So Natalie Asalgado is a Chilean Peruvian American social worker and psychotherapist living with living with ADHD in New York City. She primarily worked with bilingual queer young adults of color navigating life transitions, working on their relationships, and figuring out what it means to be authentically them. Natalie obtained a certificate in family and couple treatment at the Institute of Contemporary Psychotherapy. So, Natalie, the microphone is yours. So, do you mind to share the presentation, Millie, please?
Thank you, Hugo. Thank you, Millie. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited, even though most of your camera off, that's okay. I'm so excited to have you all here for this presentation tonight. It is entitled Understanding Your Loved One's Brain, Neurodivergence in the Immigrant Family. And I'm talking to you about this today because, hi, I have a neurodivergent brain. And my parents immigrated to the US by way of France from Peru and Chile. So this is hopefully going to be an interactive presentation. I hope to hear from you all, or you can drop your answers, questions in the chat. Millie, can we go to the next slide? So we'll start by talking about the difference between neurodiversity and neurodivergence. Then we'll share experiences. I'd love to hear from you all. I'll also share some experiences that I've come across. And then we'll wrap up with strategies for creating validating environments for all this diversity. So I said neurodiversity. Does anyone in the chat know what neurodiversity is? Has anyone heard of it before? You can give a thumbs up as a reaction. Yeah, I see a few. Neurodiversity is just the natural variation of our brains. It's not a medical term, it's a general one. It was actually coined in 1998 by Judy Singer in her thesis. And it was to promote the equality and inclusion of neurological minorities. If we go to the next slide, we have neurodivergence. Or, like I found with Instagram handle ABA Amiga, neurosazon. So just a little bit of spice for our brains. Again, it's a non-medical term that describes people whose brain differences affect how their brain works. And so this creates different strengths, different challenges from people whose brains don't have these differences. So this means there's really no right or wrong way to think. In fact, we have all these differences here on this slide. I know there's a lot up there, but we'll focus today on autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also known as ADHD. Maria, I love that. Neurospicy. And so, right, because of neurodiversity, right, these variations in our brains, we have all these different neurological and developmental conditions. On the next slide, we'll see the strengths of all these neurological conditions. Feel free to take a moment to just take this in. I know there's a lot of information on there. And like I said, we'll be focusing on autism, which you'll see in the purple circle on the left, which strengths have fine detail processing, memory, concentration, and ADHD in teal on the upper right hand, where with ADHD, you can have more energy, passion, creativity, focus. So, like I said, there's a lot of information here. I'm happy to share the slides with you all after this. We'll first look at autism. So, Millie, can we pass to the next slide? Thank you. So, autism might be recognized by avoiding eye contact. Maybe someone is repeating their words over and over. Maybe they have trouble with transitions or change. Maybe they move their body in different ways, like rocking it to soothe, or maybe they bite their fingernails. Has anyone ever encountered any of these behaviors before? Again, you can feel free to type in the chat or use a thumbs up. Yeah. This is one of the more common ones that we'll see. And another common one is ADHD. And so if we go to the next slide, you'll see someone might miss details, make mistakes, talk a lot. Yes, there can be this gendered presentation of symptoms, and we'll talk about that. So thank you for bringing that up, Barrett. Because even as we talked about the symptoms of autism, the symptoms of ADHD are definitely gendered and skewed toward male presenting, or really what we consider as sex assigned at birth for men. And so someone with ADHD might lose items, might become easily distracted, interrupt others. And so I was wondering, we can go to the next slide. You all said some of this sounded familiar with the autism slide. What about with the ADHD slide? Yeah. Yes, Maria, right? It's that both of those social identities. It's where race comes into play and gender. So we can go ahead to the next slide. As I was piling this information, I was wondering, right, how much of the world is considered neurodivergent? Does anyone have any idea of what percentage of the world's population is considered neurodivergent? I gave you a multiple choice just for fun. As we're not doing this as a test, feel free to drop your answers in the chat. Okay, some C's, A's, B's. I don't know, but I feel like it's probably underreported. So, Millie, can you give us the answer? 15 to 20%. So those of you who guessed or said or knew it was C, that means it's 1 in 5, right? So let's think about that. That's a really high number. And yes, you all will have access to the slides. So please don't feel like you have to write everything down. Take it in, and then I'm also happy to chat with you offline after. Oh, 15 to 20% of the world's population is considered neurodivergent. I don't know about you all, but it seems kind of low. I think it's higher. But tell me, what do you all think of this percentage? And Millie, that's on the next slide. Thank you. Does it seem high? Does it seem low? Just right? Bernadette thinks it's low. Yesenia.
Yeah.
Yep, Rosario. Yeah. Actually, rates have been increasing. Thank you for going to the next one, because there's been a 43% increase in the rates of ADHD in children from the year 2000 to 2011. And actually, the rate of increase was greatest among Latinx folks at 83%. And here we have, some personal firsthand experiences of Dr. Sandra Leon Villa. And she says, things I experienced as an autistic Latina are not wanting to kiss or hug everyone at family gatherings because I don't like touch from everyone. Feeling different. People thinking I'm stuck up because I'm quiet. Being perceived as rude for speaking my mind. And so because of these negative perceptions of just being, autistic folks can mask their behaviors. So on the next slide, we'll see some examples of that, where people might say, oh, you're smiling, so I'll smile too. Or if you're making eye contact, I'll make eye contact. Or I'm going to a really energy consuming event, let me make sure I have time for me after. And someone who's autistic said anonymously, being something that I neurologically am not is exhausting. I gave you all a lot of information about autism, ADHD. We're going to keep diving into this, but let's ground ourselves back in that we are, right, with the Latinx Therapist Action Network. We're all talking about immigration. We know this. There's lots of barriers to immigration. What barriers do you all think neurodivergent immigrants might face? Feel free to unmute yourselves. Feel free to type in the chat. Yeah, Bernadette says communication difficulties. Veronica writes access to services. We see access to assessment, access to therapy / treatment, understanding social rules, quote unquote, and customs, social interaction, stigma, assuming difficulties come from lack of education. Yes, cultural competent therapists and primary care. All of these are super important. Insurance barriers. So we'll see on the next slide all of these things you all said, right? Policies that are anti-immigrant, language barriers, stigma, our cultural perception of different behaviors, and then others, cultural or lack of cultural understanding. And all of these can lead to failings by larger systems. And I mean, you all probably know this already, but this isn't just limited to New York, right? There's a reason we put this webinar at this time to hopefully get folks from across the nation, because immigrants are everywhere. So you all talked about this a little bit already in the chat, but people might not be able to access care. Or if they get care, they might not get it from a culturally competent provider. So Millie, can you go to the next slide for me? Thank you. That leads us to misdiagnosis or even underdiagnosis. The author of a book called Unmasking Autism writes, if you're, let's say, a young autistic Black boy, you are far more likely to get diagnosed with something like oppositional defiant disorder. You're more likely to be seen as a behavior problem. I'm glad you like that book. It's a good one. It's ethnic minority youth who hold minoritized identities like learning disabilities, along with their racial, ethnic backgrounds, may be misdiagnosed or not diagnosed at all. Children of color are more likely to be diagnosed with conduct and personality disorders. The book is called Unmasking Autism. Bernadette is saying, we see this all the time in schools with special education eligibilities. Yes, I mean, then cis girls or women are misdiagnosed with depression, anxiety, personality disorders, even eating disorders, because some of it might be autistic traits, especially in English or, yeah, English language learner students. Right. Latino children are actually diagnosed autistic 2.5 years later than white non-Latino children. If you think about that, that's such a big gap, especially at a younger age. Imagine being able to catch, you know, the being able to offer the services that they might need in second grade versus fourth grade. That's huge. We need to talk about this more. We talk about it a lot being involved with the immigrant community, but people need to see that these are startling numbers, right? Like if we look at that graph, this is from 2018 to 2019, 24 out of every 100 white students with disabilities were removed from class for disciplinary reasons, compared to 64 out of every 100 Black students with disabilities who were removed for the same reasons. These are hard things to sit with. Don't worry, we're going to get to the part where we talk about what do we do with this. But this is important information to get out there. Before we go to the next slide, I do want to ask, what do you think then are some of the cultural influences that might be influencing misdiagnosis or underdiagnosis? Again, feel free to unmute yourselves or drop your thoughts in the chat.
Hi, I don't want to take up too much space, but really, one thing we're seeing a lot now just ties into a lot of we do special education and school discipline advocacy, and a lot of our clients are newly arrived youth who don't speak Spanish and don't speak English because they speak an indigenous language. So then that's like an added layer of just like talk about not understanding their cultural norms or their societal norms and trying to integrate into our communities. It's been a really difficult experience for them. So I think that adds another layer that also kind of gets lost in the school and education systems.
Yeah. No, I'm really glad you shared that, Bernadette. And please, no one feel free like you're taking up too much space. I want this to be interactive. We have another hour, and I planned on this being a conversation. Yeah, Beatriz.
Sí, buenas tardes.
Buenas.
Culturalmente en Latinoamérica, la parte de la salud mental en niños y en adultos es algo que no es prioridad. Me pasó a mí justamente con mi hijo de 6 años en tiempo de pandemia, pues notaba, ¿verdad?, que era muy hiperactivo, que se levantaba, que esto. Pero aparte yo tuve el privilegio que mi papá es docente en El Salvador, entonces siempre estuve como, ellos estuvieron al cuidado de mí y pude identificar muchas de estas cosas. Y cuando lo mencioné en la escuela fue como, lo primero que me dijeron fue, qué bueno que viniste porque casi ningún padre viene, porque usualmente, y es demasiado triste, se escucha, pero las expresiones van desde, no, es que son tontos, es que son burros o no aprenden, y ahí vienen y se crean los niños problemas. Ahí vienen y se crean los niños que después, al no ser comprendidos y entendidos desde sus casas, viene a generarse la violencia. Y es el mismo patrón que sucede en El Salvador. con las pandillas. Cuando yo estaba en El Salvador, estaba en un programa de jóvenes y conocí a muchos niños de edades muy pequeñas, entre 10 a menos años, que eran de familias disfuncionales o porque sus papás habían migrado para este país, estaban con un familiar, nadie los cuidaba, eran abusados verbalmente, físicamente, psicológicamente, incluso sexualmente. Y de ahí nacía mucho aquella búsqueda de una familia y se integraban a pandillas. Estuve haciendo trabajo con jóvenes de mi edad por mucho tiempo y es algo que pude ver, al igual que lo que se ve acá, y es esa parte que la sociedad en nuestros países normaliza la violencia en todos sus tipos. Entonces, para muchos padres acá, porque también hay que reconocer que mucha de nuestra gente, además de que no hablan inglés, muchos no han tenido acceso a educación y no conocen todas estas cosas que ahora sí podemos tener acceso. Y también en las escuelas hay personas que no quieren dar este acceso a información porque son racistas. Entonces la gente se siente intimidada y es parte también como de aprender como papás que si vemos algo diferente en nuestros hijos, primero vamos a escuchar de ellos y después vienen esas quejas, esos lamentos de que niños están pasando por situaciones de drogas, por otro tipo de cosas y muchas veces es porque cuando eran pequeños nadie los trató, nadie los escuchó. Entonces todo el mundo criminaliza y al final uno se da cuenta que hay muchachos que andaban en pandillas con 10 años, 11 años y ya siendo jefes de pandillas, teniendo una inteligencia, y no estoy alabando eso, pero simplemente tienen una capacidad. Y en el caso del autismo, no estoy diciendo que eso era lo que les pasa, pero todos estos niños tienen una capacidad de poder analizar y de poder dimensionar muchas cosas que si alguien les hubiera prestado la atención necesaria, quizás fueran personas diferentes y construyendo un mundo y una sociedad diferente. Pero desafortunadamente somos parte de ese problema, parte de la parte del capitalismo que ha infundido Estados Unidos hacia nuestras comunidades. Gracias.
No, gracias a usted, Beatriz, porque eso es muy importante para pensar en cómo es que nosotros podemos romper ese ciclo negativo. Y veo que mientras que estabas hablando, Veronica said, mistrust with systems. Barrett agreed, I see your hand. And Maria said they can become the identified patient, right? Then the child becomes the scapegoat. Barrett, please share with
Hi.
us.
Yes. Hi, everyone. I apologize if I'm not very coherent. I'm getting over a bad stomach bug. Speaking from the perspective of a school social worker in Illinois. So I'm not sure how these laws might be different or policies in different areas, but when we talk about special education, especially in the schools, we don't provide medical diagnoses. We provide educational diagnoses to help serve our students. And we have a very large immigrant population at our school, and especially our non-English speaking immigrant students. And what we find a lot is it is very difficult to even find a student eligible for any type of special education because one of the exclusionary factors is cultural differences and language differences, which means they can't even become eligible for an initial evaluation because that's considered an exclusionary factor. And then if we're able to overcome that barrier, I think there becomes, for lack of a better phrase, like a laziness in trying to truly reach respectfully and give informed consent to a family to provide and understand what services their student might need to be successful because they hear a label of a disability. And understandably so, like recently we had this with one of our students, and mom was just so nervous that this diagnosis would follow her child for the rest of their life and would impact them in their jobs, impact them in their future, impact them if there was an issue regarding deportation or change in movement. And instead of taking the time to understand the validity of those worries and fears, they just slap on a different diagnosis and say, we'll just give the same services and it will be fine. When you can see the lack of understanding and miscommunication between the staff and the parent, and watching the student sit through his whole meeting and clearly be dysregulated, clearly we need a break, mom saying it's disrespectful to leave, we needing to sit through it. And I think it's not a failure on the family. It's not a failure on the parents. We can say, oh, well, they just don't get it. But really, it's a failure on the education system and the school to not provide this in meaningful and relevant ways and actually service the student appropriately. It's like we feed into the same negative stereotypes and stigmas because we just don't, it's like not wanting to, like, quote, put up a fight, when I think that just frames like the immigrant family as like the enemy, as opposed to someone to partner with and understand and include.
Thank you, Barrett, because I mean, from my experiences working in our school system here in New York, it doesn't sound that much different, unfortunately. And it's heartbreaking, because with more patience, with more education, with more trust, we can offer the services that not only the kids, the teens might need, but also ensure that, like this presentation is called, Understanding Our Loved One's Brain, that the family can understand what's happening for their loved one. Let me see, Beatriz. De acuerdo, pero también ahí se implica la falta de justicia del lenguaje, tanto verbal como escrita, para padres y alumnos. El sistema está diseñado para criminalizar a las comunidades vulnerables, y eso debe hacer un cambio que necesitamos con urgencia. Tenemos que romper este ciclo. Millie, let's go to the next slide, please. Because you all have talked about so much of this, right? Que no puede ser mi hijo. No seas tonto. Yo no quiero ser loco. Yo no soy loco y yo no necesito ayuda. La gente solo lo hace para llamar la atención. This is like the micro level, right? But we need the systemic factors to be able to explain what is going on and break down these stereotypes that someone might not be able to sit still, someone might fidget, someone might have trouble focusing, might not maintain eye contact, might not hug or kiss others. That this is not because they're lazy, they're rude, they're disinterested, that they're weak. That I hear this one where religion can be really helpful, but then it can also sometimes hinder, like, God is only going to give me what I can handle. And depending on different things, oftentimes we're more likely to take a medication for high blood pressure than we are for ADHD. And it can be really helpful to educate families, communities about the pros and the cons of medication, the pros and the cons of changing the environment, like whether it's in school and offering them an integrated classroom. There are so many resources that we need to be offering to our loved ones. Just looking at this slide, what are you all thinking? Okay, you all did a lot of talking on the other one. So then we'll go to the next one.
Can you say more on the family unity, that last one on there?
Yes, actually, that's a really great segue into the next one. But what I'm talking about there is right, I'm gonna use the general we're close to our families, for better and for worse. And so sometimes, like, let's actually go to the next slide so I can dive into this concept of familismo a little bit more. This concept of familismo can be really helpful when we make a big change, when we transition, right? When we go to a new country, because it can protect us. We have our people, we know our people, we trust them. I mean, it's even linked to better health outcomes. We see lower rates of drug use. We see higher rates of mammogram screenings, lower rates of like physical ailments. And, right, when we think about familismo and how it's then more common to prioritize others' needs before our own, that can be the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the pretty, and the exciting, and the nerve-wracking. It can be everything. Because when we come to a new country, we're figuring out what it means to be us here. And that might lead to a change in values by virtue of acculturation. And then what does it mean to be like, well, I learned about ADHD for me at the age of maybe 26. I had already finished all of the schooling that I think I'll ever do. And I was like, why was it so hard to focus, to read? But my family said, I love them. And they said, just try harder, just focus. And so that kind of family unity has its strengths. And for me, its weaknesses. Maria, did that answer your question? Yeah. Before I go on to fatalismo, which we'll get into, what are people thinking about familismo?
I want to bounce off of what you said, Natalie. It sounded like you were giving a personal testament, like your own experience about being diagnosed.
Yes.
So my sister, she's 41 now, but she didn't get diagnosed until she was in med school. Right? She was in a junior philharmonic when she was in high school, all the things, high school, what do you call it? Above the 4.0 thing. She played the cello since she was in 4th grade, hence the philharmonic thing. Yeah, so is that early 20s? Like after, I don't know, med school is like
Long.
sounds about right. Early 20s. She's an ER doctor now. Like, I don't know how to describe it. She's a little girl from Southern California of Mexican immigrant parents who went straight to UC Santa Barbara, did some kind of prepping for med school at UC Irvine, and they got accepted to various schools, one being Harvard Med School. So that was a no-brainer, essentially, where dad's like, Harbor, oh, I know Harbor Medical, it's in LA, Harbor. And mom is like, oh, Austin. at Boston, like they're wondering if that's Boston, Massachusetts, or is it Austin, Texas? Like there's just, we don't know, but she went very far until she was struggling with math, with med school classes. So that's the
Yeah. It can be so stressful because, like, I didn't know why I found it so hard. And Barrett was adding in the chat, their fiance got diagnosed with autism at 24. There's all these ways in which, when we have minoritized identities, people, including our loved ones, can write us off because we need more education. We need more culturally competent providers. We need more patience. And I mean, to that end, that's why I wanted to talk about fatalismo, which I didn't really have a word for that until really more recently. This like kind of face, this like resignation that everything is inevitable. Sometimes that can come from religion, spirituality, because, oh, my path is already laid out for me. But sometimes it's also like, I put in an example, like a medical sense. You know, if my mom, if my parents have diabetes, then I will most likely have diabetes. What we know is that we can actually challenge some of that genetics. I'm not saying we'll get rid of diabetes if we just will it away, but that we can educate ourselves, others, for example, on diabetes. We can have culturally competent care, culturally responsive providers. And with that kind of patience and respect, will create more positive experiences in healthcare settings. And so that goes back into mental health care, right? What does it mean to have a teacher who recognizes that, okay, the cultural exception doesn't mean this child doesn't need a diagnosis, but rather that they need education around the diagnosis so they can actually feel empowered and continue to receive services that will improve their quality of life. But this more so can, right, like I said, come from religion, spirituality, but it can also come from consistently being told that life's going to be hard when you immigrate. I am feeling the question, and I put the presentation together of where do we go from here, right? Like, now what? People have been throwing ideas already, but before I keep going, does anyone else have other ideas that they want to share? What do you want to do with this information?
Hi, my name is Brian Dominguez. I wanted to speak a little bit on like ideas to jump out there. Um, so I have a long medical history of just being from at a young age, very little, being survivor of cancer. So I have been around talking with doctors and like being involved with what my family has been doing to take care of me when I was young. So there's been a lot of like introduction to how do we take care of someone who was diagnosed with this, and then is this a good thing or whatnot? So because my family are immigrants themselves, it was a whole new experience that wasn't really expected for them. And so now that my mom specifically, who took care of me the most, had to learn all of this diagnosis and all of the procedures and what was going on. She tends to become an advocate um for the rest of my family of like, hey, maybe you should look into this. Or yeah, look into your son might be having some type of can be diagnosed with something that can help them in the long run at an early age. So we start seeing a lot of like early stages of diagnosis that can be like either ADHD or even like other diagnoses you had mentioned in the presentation. So I feel like once we get involved with a diagnosis and we start seeing the symptoms and we start seeing some of those symptoms a little bit more clearly, we can try to advocate for someone, even um, we're advocating in the sense that that doesn't bring too much stigma because we're already within the family.
Yeah. That's a great point, Brian. Thank you for sharing your story with us, or part of it. I mean, so I shared a little bit about how I was diagnosed, probably, I don't know, it was 26, 27, but it was really because my older sister, who's 14 years older, actually got diagnosed. So she got diagnosed a lot later in life with ADHD. And I was like, me? Maybe. And then her son got diagnosed because we then knew what to look for. I mean, it did help. He had the classic boy symptoms, right? Like we talked about, that it's very gendered for like the DSM-5. But then we were talking about my niece, right? Her daughter, and how it presents more inattentive, like it does for myself and my sister. She was staring at her homework for hours. And now she doesn't have to do that anymore. So we can jump in once we have this information directly within our own families. And Beatriz, I saw that you were writing about, right, treating that guilt, that embarrassment, that sense of fault, because there is this fear that other people will judge us and they'll fault us for those differences. Millie, let's go to the next slide and we can talk about, for folks who might be autistic in this room and find themselves masking, right? I mentioned that book. Oh my gosh, the title just left me. It's by Devin Price. Someone put it in the chat earlier. Unmasking Autism. This is an exercise in compassionate unmasking. Right? Thinking about moments when you felt alive, when you felt amazed, recharged, satisfied. What do these moments have to say about what I value? Because when we mask, we use energy. We can definitely decide to do that, but we don't have to. We can, like this infographic says, listen to our bodies. We can do what feels right. We can ask for time alone, take that time alone. We can, this one's my favorite, step into sensory calm. Maybe that's rocking. Maybe that's playing with a certain kind of texture. The hardest one is probably don't take on others' judgments. That's probably something we can all try to do more often. Now, for those of us who might not have these brain differences, Millie, if we could, thank you. We can do our best to communicate as clearly as possible and avoid using esos dichos, those turns of phrase, like the early bird gets the worm. Like, what does that mean? We can accept behaviors that maybe they look different than what we expect. They might be different than what we consider quote unquote normal. And right, there's so much judgment embedded within normal. If we need to change plans, we can give people notice. Like, if you have, particularly for young ones, maybe, you know, they're playing and then you tell them 5 more minutes and then they have the tantrum. Creating some kind of routine or even counting down earlier than 5 minutes. Like, okay, we're going to do this from 7:30 to 8:30. Okay, remember, we're doing this until 8:30, so we have 30 minutes left because we need to go to bed so that you can get enough rest, so that tomorrow morning we can have another good day. All these kinds of ways we can offer support. There are all these kinds of ways that we can offer support to our loved ones, right? And really at its core is being kind, being patient, and like you all are doing here, learning more from each other. Maybe you learned something new in this presentation, but we can continue observing the world around us and our loved ones and really trying to be empathetic. Does anyone else have other ideas for ways we can show up better for our loved ones or maybe for us?
I want to highlight support LGBTQIA identities because I'm hearing, and I have a colleague that's, I guess, writing her PhD based on overlap of identities like neurodivergence, LGBTQIA plus collective membership, chronic illness. Can you say more on that?
Definitely. It's unfortunate that trans individuals might be even more likely to go undiagnosed, despite the fact that they're actually 3 to 6 times more likely to be autistic as compared to cisgender folks. There's actually a lot more research going into gender, sexuality, and neurodivergence. Barrett, please feel free to share more.
I was going to kind of echo what you just said. I know there's a large comorbidity and the studies are increasing in that because if you think about it, the idea of gender is a social construct, and what we look at social norms and heteronormativity in general, it's actually it makes more sense and is more natural, especially for autistics, where this prescribed rule doesn't make sense. It fits into a box that doesn't click in the same way. So I think that's kind of like the causation element of that comorbidity, of like the explanation of the why do we see this, because I also don't want there to be, like, not from anyone in this room, but in general, you know, again, the stigma of like, oh, now everybody's autistic, everybody's gay, everybody's trans. There's like those very dehumanizing and lack of acknowledgement of these identities when they're comorbidity. I say comorbidity as if it was like a disease. I'm literally gay. But the intersectionality of these identities actually make a lot of like sense.
Yeah. I really appreciate you expanding on that, Barrett, because it can easily become this, oh my gosh, now they're holding all these minoritized identities, but no, there's a relationship for a reason. It's that all of these social constructs can't work for every single human. I mean, we are not meant to be put in boxes. Which leads me into then sort of the bigger picture, right? You all touched on the systemic issues. We need access to healthcare, but not just any healthcare, right? Quality healthcare with culturally responsive providers and affordable healthcare where we're not going into medical debt for seeking services. We need this integration of the physical and the mental because we know that what happens in our body then affects how we feel, and we know how what we feel affects our body. They just go hand in hand. And we talked about education settings. We need to be inclusive. We need to highlight everyone's strengths. At the beginning, there was that slide where there was a little like outline of a person's head, and all of these different neurological differences have strengths. It's not just that, oh, we need to adapt for them because of their weaknesses. It's if someone is autistic, typically they have fine detail processing, they have better memory. Sometimes they're more honest. We have ADHD, we can be more authentic, we can focus more readily on a particular issue, we can be more creative. Teachers can use these different strengths in the classroom. It doesn't have to be that, oh, I have, a kid with a different learning need, and then, oh, I need to plan my lesson so differently. No, we can include everyone and make it a creative learning environment. And to what we were just talking about with gender and sexuality, we need an intersectional lens. We need to take into account overlapping social minoritized identities. The term intersectionality was thought to be coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. And she writes, when they enter, we all enter. It's very, very important. She was talking particularly about Black women moving up in the world, that when we have folks who hold more minoritized identities, when we prioritize them and center them, we all win. Let me see what Beatriz was saying. Para nuestra comunidad, ir a terapia significa perder un día de trabajo que afecta la economía a final del mes. Yep, this is true. I know my translators are working, but when we miss work, it does affect our pay. And that is a very real reality. And so I do say that one of the pros of therapy, now that the pandemic started in 2020 and then has not gone away, these virtual options offer more flexibility for being there. But I know that is still not as accessible to everyone as I would like it to be. And I'm hopeful that once we start centering more minoritized identities, we can really start to make movement.
I think one of the things that I've found kind of hard, and I'm trying to really think about if I see this in like Latinx immigrant families specifically overall, and it just may be skewed because I work primarily with Spanish speaking families. But one of the things that comes up a lot is, especially if there's a neurodiverse child and that may be their only neurodiverse child, there's this extra frustration of, my other kids weren't like this. It wasn't so hard with my other kids. And it's like working with the family to be like, yeah, he thinks differently, like this is, so some of the things that worked with your other kids aren't going to work. So let's figure out what's going to work with your kiddo now. But that's something we run into a lot. And it's just kind of like, it's a barrier in the sense that I sometimes feel like that child is othered from the family, right? The black sheep, the one that stands out. And so trying to also recognize how that feeling, that sensation is impacting the young person too.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that happens. We see it often. And I'm really glad you raised that point, Bernadette, because that's where I really hope that we can offer more and more education, whether, like Brian was saying, to like within the family, or maybe it's in the community, in a school. I actually want to leave you all with some resources that maybe will be helpful, Bernadette, to some of those families. Like there's a book and an app called Jose Aprende, and it's just the cutest thing. It has incredible reviews. There's also, if you don't really want to read something, you don't want to use an app, there's videos on YouTube, how to ADHD, or blogs, embrace-autism.com. These are just some resources. There's so much out there, and that's how we combat the othering. Let me see what Beatriz is saying. Sí, muchos padres se culpan entre sí. Ahí despega otra capa de la violencia en el hogar y los hijos crecen escuchando y sintiéndose culpables. Mhm. Right. It's not okay for them to grow up in that kind of sometimes verbally abusive environments, and we can offer more information. Not every parent, not every person is going to take that information and just be like, now I have found the magic key. I understand my loved one. But it's about being patient and persistent. Singer, who coined the term neurodiversity, I put a quote where it says here, I also say there's a right to work and there's a right not to work. The bottom line for a better world for neurodivergent people is a universal basic income and more investment in social housing and no punitive welfare systems, which are often about forcing the nearest square peg into the nearest round hole. Is that going to happen? Well, it should happen. I am so grateful to you all for letting me offer this information to you all, and for, in return, sharing so much of your own experiences with me and everyone here today. Are there any questions that anyone has? Are there any stories that people want to share? Because we have 15 minutes. Natalia.
Hello. Hi, everyone. Um, I I really loved this presentation. Um, I I was also actually very recently told that I may have also be experiencing ADHD in my life, and I have so many things that I would love to say, but obviously it will be impossible. But sometimes I like to think of all of my ideas as a tree branch, how each and every single branch just branches off into something new and smaller. And so that's exactly what's happening in this moment. But I will just mention one thing right now. I'm currently studying my master's in social work. I'm graduating in 2025. And it's a struggle sometimes with the education system here, where I'm constantly questioning and often want to talk about the decolonization of social work, which is not always a welcomed conversation that my teachers want to engage with. But I've been learning more about how to talk about mental health with my father, who is 73 years old, also Peruvian. And he's been learning to engage in conversations about the things that we carry generationally, intergenerationally. One of the books that I absolutely love is It Didn't Start With You. And I actually bought it for him in Spanish. But the book talks a lot about the things that we inevitably pick up in our life from our families, and sometimes even through generations that may not have ever even touched us. And then we can, of course, go into epigenetics. But one of the things that I'm really trying to do through my studies and my personal work and projects is I want to involve the conversation around mental health more to nature. I think it can be difficult to talk about mental health and clinical terms and diagnoses and the DSM. But I've noticed that when I've had conversations with my father and some family members about the relationship between nature and ourselves, it's been an easier thing to land, right? So we have seasons, we have when leaves are falling, we have when leaves are turning colors, we have spring when things are blooming. And so some of the things that I'm trying to learn how to do better is, if we don't want to talk about the clinical mental health, that's fine. But we can talk about emotional health, right? We can talk about what it is that we need for inner peace and defining inner peace, because a lot of the times our family members have never even had the privilege or the time to think about what that means to them. So that's just something that I wanted to share. I think if we can't relate to the clinical terms of mental health, I think we can always relate to nature. And that's been a very interesting, just an interesting journey as I figure out how to communicate and connect with people about emotional health and behavioral health awareness. But thank you so
Thank you.
much.
No, thank you, Natalia, because that was beautiful. You would really love the book Braiding Sweetgrass if you haven't read it already.
I've started
It's
it.
good. And for anyone who doesn't know, it's a book about plants, indigeneity, and our well-being. And because you're in school, I truly wish you all the best. I'm happy to connect with you because if no one's told you yet, your life will be upended in social work grad school. That book is called Braiding Sweetgrass. Yes, thank you. And habrá parte dos. Oh, I don't know. We can talk about it. Oh, thank you all so much.
I wanted to piggyback on Natalia Cornejo's in talking about clinical terms or mental health with nature. I've sort of been doing that or something similar where I'm talking about processing trauma in the sense of viewing artwork or building installations. So some of the work that I do, or I'm a visual artist that focuses in painting and drawing, but also starting to like get involved with installation work, and part of it's processing my medical history and how I'm doing that, but also how can I start expanding upon helping others in processing their own trauma. So it's very fascinating how we're already sort of doing that and branching out and finding other ways that doesn't feel like stigma.
And in such a creative way. We need to process all that we've experienced ourselves and generations before us in all kinds of ways. That's incredible. Feel free to unmute yourself, Beatriz.
Sí, gracias. Escuchando de las generaciones, una pregunta es, o más bien un pensamiento también, o reflexión, ¿cómo podemos reconciliarnos con nuestros ancestros? Y hablo en el caso muy personal, mi mamá también está pasando una situación complicada con su salud emocional, al punto de que está siendo medicada para poder dormir. Y por mucho tiempo estuve como, mamá, tenemos que ir a terapia, tienes que ir esto, pero me di cuenta que al estarle insistiendo también era como que llegó un punto en que se enojó, pero no tenía todavía en ese momento, digamos, el grado de entendimiento que estoy teniendo un poquito ahora, que he aprendido como a ver cómo se ven las cosas un poquito más allá, pero sí es algo que, ¿cómo sanamos a nuestras abuelas, a nuestros abuelos, a nuestros tíos que han venido, si ahorita nuestras generaciones que están llegando vienen normalizando, venimos normalizando tanto la violencia? Es porque nos enseñaron en nuestras casas, es porque eso era lo que veíamos en nuestras casas. Entonces, a partir de ahí también, ¿cómo queremos extender esa mano de ayuda, ese poquito de amor para nuestras ancestras e incluso para podernos dejar de culpar a nosotros en algún sentido? Porque, pues, en mi caso yo estoy teniendo un privilegio que mi mamá no tiene. Y aunque he dejado de culparme y responsabilizarme por muchas cosas, no puedo dejar de lado el hecho de que tuvo que pasar tantas cosas, no sé cuántas ella también, y ver que yo ahora veo las cosas de una forma diferente y que me gustaría que ella las pudiera palpar de esta manera, aún ya en su edad adulta, y que no sé cuáles serían como las formas de poder llegar a que eso comience a florecer de alguna manera.
Mm. Esto siempre me ha parecido una pregunta más difícil, porque cuando vemos cómo es que ellos pueden cambiar y no lo hacen por alguna razón o varias razones, es difícil. Because we're like, you can do better, you can be better. But what I have found most helpful and I feel free for others to chime in, although I know we only have just a few minutes, is asking for their stories and listening, truly listening, listening to understand, not to respond. It's hard. It is. Offer yourself that compassion that what do I need if they don't change? And how do I make peace with that? Or how do I accept it even if I don't approve of it?
Yo quería agregar a lo que acaban de hablar. Yo puedo casi de repente con exactitud en mi propia forma sentir lo que estabas diciendo. Yo a veces siento que cargo, no sé si es guilt, pero como una tristeza inmensa de pensar de que mis padres no pueden sentir ese alivio que yo puedo con mi privilegio de experimentar con salud mental de la forma que yo lo he sentido. Y es difícil porque tengo que llegar a un punto donde me tengo que repetir que mis padres han hecho y están haciendo lo mejor que ellos pueden hacer con lo que tienen y con lo que saben. Pero sí puedo entender, por lo menos desde mi perspectiva con mis padres, que a veces siento una pena profunda y tristeza de pensar que ellos no podrán sentir y realizarse de la forma que yo emocionalmente he podido hasta ahora. Y eso creo que es lo más duro.
I'm just so moved by the vulnerability that you all have shown tonight. We don't know each other, and I know I was presenting, but this is a space that I felt heard and held. And I think that's how we heal. That's how we grieve together in community. I really appreciate all of you for spending this hour and a half with me tonight. If you'd like to stay in contact, my email is there. And I'm happy to chat more.
Thank you so much, Natalie. It was amazing. And I think that I'm going to echo Beatriz that we're going to try to convince you for doing a second session, perhaps, hopefully soon, because it was interesting. And also, I feel that this is just like the peak of the iceberg. Like there's many things that we could talk. There's many themes, that many topics that we could just have different approaches. So this is just like a brief um, summary of everything. It's just huge. It's enormous. So I'm gonna thank you all. I'm gonna put in the chat briefly if you were not here at the beginning. We're trying to raise some money for emotional support and for healing circles. Healing circles. So I'm gonna put in the chat the English version and the Spanish version if you want to donate to Latinx Therapist Action Network. And please share it. You could donate $5, $10, whatever. And also, I shared the website of the Latinx Therapist Action Network, my email in case you need to contact me or need anything. And finally, I like to thank you, to thank Millie and Diana from the staff to help me and help us